Spring 536. Across the Roman world, people looked up and saw something that should not have been possible. At noon, bodies cast almost no shadow. The sun appeared pale, even blue, and its warmth seemed to have vanished. In Italy, the statesman Cassiodorus described a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, and a summer without heat. In Constantinople, the historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave light without brightness, like the moon. This was not an eclipse. The dimness did not pass in minutes. It remained through a year of war, failed harvests, and fear. At the center of that world stood Emperor Justinian, attempting to restore the Roman Empire while the sky itself appeared to turn against him. Then came another volcanic blow, and in 541, plague reached the empire. For 15 centuries, the cause of the darkened sun remained hidden. But the sky had left evidence. In the rings of ancient trees, in microscopic fragments of ash, and in layers of ice buried high inside glaciers. Today, that evidence confirms a catastrophe, but it also exposes how much of the familiar story remains uncertain. The volcano responsible for 536 has still not been identified. The death toll of the plague is still debated, and the worst year in history is not a fact that any instrument can measure. This is the story of what happened when the sun disappeared, and how science reopened one of history's oldest cold cases. There was no global network of observatories in the 6th century. No satellite measured the light. No thermometer recorded the temperature. What survives is fragmentary. Letters, chronicles, state documents, and memories copied by later hands. Yet several of those fragments describe the same disturbing change. Cassiodorus was not an isolated monk writing rumors in the margins of a book. He was one of the most experienced administrators in the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy. When he wrote about the strange seasons, he was trying to explain a practical crisis. The weather was disrupting agriculture. The sun appeared bluish. Shadows at noon had almost vanished. Frost came at the wrong time. His language is literary, but the anxiety behind it is administrative. If the seasons fail, taxes, grain supplies, and political order fail with them. Far to the east, Procopius of Caesarea was recording the wars of Emperor Justinian. He described the sun giving light without brightness for an entire year and compared the effect to an eclipse. His sentence has become the most famous testimony of 536, but it must be read carefully. Procopius was not reporting that the sun literally vanished from every place on earth. He was describing a prolonged, unnatural dimness as it appeared from his part of the Mediterranean world. Other traditions speak of cold, harvest failure, and unusual skies in regions stretching from Europe toward Western Asia. Chinese historical records have also been connected with summer frost and failed crops during this period. These accounts do not form a perfect, synchronized weather map. They were written for different purposes, preserved unevenly, and sometimes copied centuries later. Still, the central observation is remarkably consistent. Daylight had lost its force. The most likely explanation is not that ash simply filled the lower atmosphere like smoke above a burning city. Large explosive eruptions can inject sulfur gases into the stratosphere. Their chemical reactions create tiny sulfate particles. These aerosols scatter incoming sunlight and can remain aloft far longer than ordinary ash. The result is a veil. The sun is still visible, but less energy reaches the surface. To the people living beneath it, none of that chemistry was known. They saw only a sky behaving against nature. And in an age when political legitimacy, harvest cycles, and divine order were deeply connected, a pale sun was more than strange weather. It was a warning no one could interpret. The darkness arrived at a moment of extraordinary imperial ambition. In Constantinople, Justinian I ruled the wealthiest surviving part of the Roman world. The Western Empire had fragmented in the previous century, but the Eastern court still commanded armies, ports, tax offices, and cities across the Eastern Mediterranean. Justinian did not intend merely to preserve what remained. He wanted restoration. His reign had already survived violence. In 532, the Nika riots burned large sections of Constantinople and threatened his throne. Justinian remained in the palace, crushed the rebellion, and began rebuilding on a monumental scale. The greatest symbol of that program was Hagia Sophia, raised in astonishing speed beneath a vast new dome. It projected a simple message: Roman power had not disappeared, it had been reborn. The same message was carried by armies. Justinian's general Belisarius defeated the Vandal kingdom in North Africa and entered Carthage. Then imperial forces moved into Italy against the Ostrogoths. In 536, the very year of the dimmed sun, Belisarius entered Rome. On a map, the reconquest can look like a sequence of colored territories changing hands. On the ground, it meant ships, horses, siege engines, garrisons, and enormous quantities of grain. Every campaign depended on predictable harvests and functioning transport. Armies were not separate from the climate. They were machines powered by agriculture. Italy was already politically divided and increasingly exposed to war. Fields could be abandoned, irrigation neglected, and local stores seized by competing forces. A sudden cooling event did not create those vulnerabilities, but it could deepen them. A weak harvest mattered more when an army was nearby. A delayed shipment mattered more when a city was under siege. This is why simple explanations fail. The eruption did not press a button marked Fall of Rome. It interacted with decisions made by rulers, generals, landowners, and communities. Justinian continued his wars after 536. His empire did not immediately collapse. In fact, imperial power still achieved remarkable military successes. But restoration became more expensive. The Gothic War dragged on for years and devastated parts of Italy. The government demanded resources across enormous distances. Then, before the first shock had fully faded from memory, the atmosphere was struck again. The story of 536 is therefore not a tale of nature replacing human history. It is a tale of nature entering human history at the worst possible moment, amplifying pressures that were already present and creating new ones that no ruler could command away. For centuries, the written descriptions of the darkened sun were treated as extraordinary stories. Their language was vivid, but there seemed to be no way to test them. The breakthrough came from an archive that had been growing silently long before Justinian was born. Every year, a tree adds a new layer of wood. When conditions are favorable, growth can be strong. When summer is unusually cold or dry, growth may be reduced. The exact response depends on species and location, which is why scientists do not read a single trunk as a global thermometer. They compare many samples, overlap living trees with older timber, and build chronologies that can extend across centuries. High-altitude and high-latitude trees are especially valuable because their growth is often limited by summer temperature. In records from parts of Europe and Asia, the middle of the 6th century stands out. The ring formed around 536 is exceptionally narrow in several chronologies. In some regions, the years that follow show continued stress. Tree ring width is only one line of evidence. The ratio of different carbon isotopes preserved in the wood can provide another view of growing conditions. Studies using these methods have identified a sharp disturbance beginning in 536, consistent with reduced sunlight and cooling after a major eruption. Yet the rings also warn against turning a complex event into a single global slogan. Not every tree responds in the same way. Moisture, soil, elevation, competition, and local weather all influence growth. A cold signal can be severe in one region and muted in another. The evidence is strongest when independent chronologies from distant places point toward the same broad pattern. In 2016, researchers proposed that a cluster of eruptions beginning in 536 helped initiate what they called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a period of cooler Northern Hemisphere summers that may have lasted, with interruptions, into the 7th century. Other scholars have argued that the duration and geographical extent should be defined more narrowly. That disagreement is not a weakness of science. It is science working as intended. The rings are physical measurements, but the historical period we construct from them depends on sampling, statistical choices, and the meaning assigned to the word period. What the trees establish with unusual force is the beginning. Something abrupt happened in the atmosphere in 536. It was followed by severe cooling in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere, and the disturbance was not merely the invention of frightened chroniclers. The witnesses had seen the sky change. The trees had recorded what happened next. Tree rings reveal the climate response. Ice cores bring us closer to the cause. On the Greenland ice sheet and in Antarctica, snow accumulates in layers. Under pressure, those layers become ice, trapping dust, sea salt, gases, and chemical traces from the atmosphere. By drilling deep cores and dating their layers, scientists can read a history of past environments. The archive is not simple. Snowfall varies, layers can thin with depth, and dates must be cross-checked. But when several cores show a similar chemical signal, the evidence can be powerful. Large volcanic eruptions release sulfur dioxide. If enough of that gas reaches the stratosphere, it forms sulfate aerosols and eventually returns to the surface. In polar ice, volcanic sulfate can appear as a distinct spike. Cores associated with the 6th century preserve not one major signal, but at least two, one around 536 and another around 540. This changed the investigation. The crisis was not the aftermath of one isolated explosion. The climate system had been struck twice within a few years. Scientists have also examined the isotopic fingerprint of sulfur in the ice. Certain unusual isotope patterns form when sulfur compounds are exposed to ultraviolet light high in the atmosphere. Those patterns help confirm that the material reached the stratosphere, the altitude required for a wide and persistent climate effect. Recent work has narrowed the search for the 536 eruption. The sulfur evidence indicates a Northern Hemisphere extratropical source. Microscopic volcanic particles recovered from ice can sometimes be compared with known volcanoes, but the match is incomplete. Iceland, once discussed as a likely source, does not fit the available evidence for this event. North American volcanic regions remain possible. None has been identified beyond reasonable doubt. The 540 eruption appears different. Its sulfur reached both hemispheres in a pattern more consistent with a tropical eruption. For a time, researchers proposed that the Tierra Blanca Joven eruption of Ilopango in present-day El Salvador might be responsible. Later chronological work complicated that identification. The timing is still debated, and a secure match has not been achieved. This uncertainty matters because documentaries often prefer a named villain. A crater can be filmed. A location can be placed on a map. Unknown volcano feels less satisfying. But uncertainty is part of the discovery. The ice tells us that enormous eruptions occurred. It tells us roughly when their products reached the atmosphere. Sulfur isotopes reveal something about latitude and altitude. What the ice does not yet provide is a signed confession. Somewhere, geological deposits may still contain the decisive match. Until they are found and dated, the most scientifically honest answer to the question, which volcano darkened the sun in 536, is also the most dramatic. We do not know. What did the atmospheric veil mean for the people below it? Volcanic aerosols reduce the sunlight reaching Earth's surface and alter circulation in the atmosphere. The average change may sound small when expressed as a fraction of a degree, but agriculture depends on seasons, not annual averages. A late frost can destroy young plants. Persistent rain can prevent grain from ripening. Cold weeks at the wrong moment can turn a difficult year into a disaster. Written sources from the 6th century describe unusual cold, poor harvests, and hunger in several regions. Some report snow or frost outside the expected season. Others speak more generally of scarcity. These accounts cannot be combined into a precise global death toll. They come from places where literate institutions survived and where someone considered the event worth recording. Silence elsewhere may mean normal conditions, or simply the absence of surviving evidence. Archaeology adds local detail but rarely produces a single answer. Storage pits, abandoned settlements, changes in animal bones, and shifts in coin circulation can reveal economic stress. Each site has its own history. War, taxation, and migration can create patterns that resemble climate damage. In northern communities, shorter growing seasons could threaten both crops and livestock. In Mediterranean regions, the outcome depended on rainfall as well as temperature. Some areas may have suffered sharply, while others remained productive enough to supply markets or armies. This unevenness shaped survival. A state with ships and tax networks could move grain if routes remained open and officials remained effective. A village without reserves had fewer options. The year 536 has often been described as the worst year to be alive. The phrase is memorable because it compresses a complicated crisis into a single image: darkness, cold, and hunger. But no historian can compare the experience of every person in every region across all of human history. For an enslaved worker, a soldier under siege, or a family facing famine, many years could be the worst. In parts of the world, 536 may have passed without becoming the defining catastrophe preserved in Mediterranean accounts. The responsible conclusion is narrower and stronger. The middle of the 6th century contained one of the most abrupt climate shocks of the last 2,000 years. It occurred during major wars. It was followed by another eruption, and it placed additional pressure on societies whose ability to respond was deeply unequal. The sun did not need to disappear everywhere to transform the lives of millions. By 540, the first shock had not become distant history. Trees in several regions still showed stress. Justinian's armies were still fighting. Communities had consumed reserves, repaired losses, and adjusted to uncertainty. Then the ice records another enormous volcanic signal. The eruption around 540 appears to have been tropical and may have produced even stronger cooling in the years that followed. Because tropical stratospheric aerosols can spread into both hemispheres, the climatic reach may have been broad. Tree ring reconstructions identify 541 and 542 among the coldest summers of the period in parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Again, the source volcano has not been established conclusively. Ilopango remains part of the scientific story because its massive Tierra Blanca Jovan eruption was once dated close to this moment. More recent work has challenged a simple match. The case demonstrates how rapidly an attractive explanation can travel beyond the evidence. Once a famous eruption is attached to a famous disaster, uncertainty tends to disappear in retelling. For people living through the sequence, the identity of the volcano made no difference. What mattered was repetition. One damaged harvest can be met with stored grain, trade, or emergency measures. Repeated disruption erodes those defenses. Seed stocks shrink. Livestock are slaughtered. Tax burdens become harder to meet. Prices rise. Families move. The second eruption also changed the historical context of the disease that appeared immediately afterward. It is tempting to draw a direct line. Volcano, famine, weakened bodies, plague. Reality is more complicated. Climate may influence rodent populations, food systems, and human movement, but the route from eruption to pandemic is not a single proven chain. What can be said is that the first plague pandemic entered a world already shaken by war and successive climate shocks. In 541, reports of a terrifying disease emerged from the Egyptian port of Pelusium. From there, it moved through the connected routes of the empire. The next catastrophe did not come from the sky. It traveled by ship. The Eastern Roman Empire depended on movement. Grain sailed from Egypt and other producing regions toward major cities. Merchants, soldiers, officials, and pilgrims traveled through ports that connected the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. These networks created wealth and power. They could also carry disease. The pathogen responsible for the first plague pandemic was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium associated with the Black Death centuries later. Ancient DNA recovered from 6th century human remains has confirmed its presence. That discovery transformed an old textual debate into a biological fact. Plague was part of the crisis. The classic transmission cycle involves fleas and rodent hosts, but historical outbreaks were shaped by more than rats aboard ships. Different flea species, human ectoparasites, local animal reservoirs, housing conditions, and patterns of movement may all have contributed. The precise pathways of the 6th century pandemic remain under study. Procopius described the disease reaching Constantinople in 542. His account is filled with fear, sudden fever, swellings, delirium, and death. He wrote of bodies overwhelming burial capacity and normal routines collapsing. Other authors also present the outbreak as a profound urban emergency. Yet eyewitness language cannot be converted directly into a citywide mortality table. Procopius wanted readers to understand an event beyond ordinary scale. His numbers and images must be evaluated as literature as well as observation. For much of modern scholarship, the Justinianic plague was treated as a demographic catastrophe that killed an enormous share of the Mediterranean population and weakened the empire permanently. In recent years, researchers have challenged that model. They point to the uneven archaeological record, limited evidence for universal settlement abandonment, and the danger of projecting later Black Death patterns backward. Other historians reply that the revision can go too far. Laws, papyri, coins, and contemporary narratives show serious disruption in particular regions. The absence of mass graves everywhere does not prove the absence of mass death. Archaeological visibility differs from place to place. The debate is not between the plague happened and the plague was invented. DNA has settled the first question. The debate concerns scale, geography, and long-term consequence. The safest conclusion is that Constantinople and some other communities suffered severe outbreaks, while the total mortality across the empire cannot be calculated with confidence. The disease returned in waves over the next 2 centuries. Its impact was probably unequal, changing as it encountered different populations, environments, and political conditions. In a documentary, a giant number can feel authoritative. In this case, refusing a false number is more accurate and more revealing. The uncertainty shows how much of the ancient world remains beyond statistical recovery. After darkness, eruption, and plague, the conclusion seems obvious. This must have ended the Roman world. But the empire did not end in 536, 540, or 542. Justinian remained emperor until 565. His government continued issuing laws, collecting taxes, constructing buildings and fighting wars. Imperial forces eventually defeated the Ostrogothic kingdom, although the long war left Italy deeply damaged. The empire retained immense resources and administrative capacity. At the same time, the limits of Justinian's restoration became clear. War consumed money and manpower. Territories were difficult to defend. In later decades, new conflicts and political transformations reshaped the Mediterranean. The Lombards entered Italy. The empire fought Persia. In the 7th century, Arab conquests removed some of its richest provinces. How much of that later history should be attributed to the 6th century climate shocks? Climate can alter the field on which decisions are made. It can reduce harvests, move populations, affect disease ecology, and strain government revenue. It rarely dictates a single political outcome. Two regions experiencing similar weather may respond differently because their institutions, trade connections, and social structures differ. The same caution applies to plague. A severe epidemic can kill workers, soldiers, and officials, but survivors inherit property. Wages may change and institutions adapt. Some effects are immediate. Others emerge only when disease interacts with war or succession crises. Without reliable population counts, many proposed chains remain plausible rather than proven. The strongest version of the climate-ended antiquity story is therefore too simple. It removes agency from historical people and turns complex transformations into environmental destiny. The opposite claim, that climate and disease were insignificant, is also difficult to defend. Contemporary witnesses noticed them. Physical archives confirm the eruptions and cooling. Ancient DNA confirms plague. These were not background details invented by modern writers. The more useful question is not whether one event caused the end of an age. It is how repeated shocks change the cost of survival. A rich state can absorb one failed harvest. A city can recover from one epidemic. An army can replace one lost supply convoy. But war, cooling, renewed eruption, and disease arrived in sequence. Each crisis consumed reserves needed for the next. The 6th century shows that collapse is rarely a single moment. It is often the narrowing of choices. Roads still exist, but fewer are safe. Taxes are still collected, but with greater difficulty. Walls still stand, but fewer soldiers defend them. Institutions continue until the distance between what they promise and what they can deliver becomes too large. The years after 536 and 540 did not produce one continuous frozen world. Climate records show variation, cold years, partial recoveries, and strong regional differences. To describe the broader pattern, researchers introduced the term Late Antique Little Ice Age. One influential reconstruction placed its beginning in 536 and extended cooler Northern Hemisphere summers to around 660. The proposed interval overlaps major historical transformations in Europe and Asia: migration, political reorganization, changing settlement patterns, and the rise and fall of regional powers. The label encouraged historians and climate scientists to work together, but it also invited overreach. Once a named climate period appears beside a timeline of wars and migrations, correlation can look like explanation. Other researchers have argued that large-scale cooling was more limited and that the coldest phase ended earlier, perhaps by the later 6th century. The difference depends partly on which tree ring records are included and how regional signals are combined. This debate reveals an important principle. Climate is experienced locally, but historical narratives are written at continental scale. A reconstruction that is useful for estimating Northern Hemisphere summer temperature may not describe rainfall in North Africa, pasture conditions in Central Asia, or harvests in every Mediterranean valley. Some proposed connections remain compelling enough to investigate. Volcanic cooling can influence monsoon systems. Changes in pasture and water may affect mobility. Harvest stress can alter prices and political legitimacy, but each connection requires its own evidence. A date shared by two graphs is a beginning, not a conclusion. There is also a danger in imagining ancient societies as passive victims of nature. People changed crops, moved herds, migrated, stored grain, opened trade routes, negotiated taxes, and appealed to religious institutions. Governments imposed controls, remitted obligations, or failed to act. Adaptation was never equal, but it was constant. The phrase late antique Little Ice Age remains useful if it is treated as a hypothesis about climate patterns, not a master key to history. It draws attention to a cluster of eruptions and decades of unusual cooling. It does not erase politics, culture, or chance. The deeper lesson of 536 is not that climate controls civilization. It is that civilization is built inside climate, and that the connection becomes visible when the expected seasons suddenly stop behaving as expected. Ice cores do more than preserve evidence of catastrophe. They also record activity. High in the European Alps, layers of ice contain traces of lead released into the atmosphere by mining and metal production. In the ancient and medieval world, lead pollution was closely connected with the extraction of silver. When people intensified mining and smelting, tiny particles traveled through the air and settled on glaciers. Research on an alpine ice core found a renewed lead signal in the middle of the 7th century. The timing has been interpreted as evidence for expanding silver production and changes in the European monetary system. After the darkest decades of the 6th century, economic networks were reorganizing. This does not mean that the old Roman world simply recovered. Political power had shifted. New kingdoms and institutions shaped Europe. The Eastern Empire survived, but in a transformed form. Communities that emerged from the crisis were not restoring a paused machine. They were building something different from the pieces that remained. The ice therefore preserves two opposite human stories. Volcanic sulfate records forces beyond human control. Lead records furnaces, labor, and economic demand. One layer speaks of disruption from the atmosphere. Another speaks of people returning to mines, minting metal, and reconnecting markets. That contrast is the true ending of the year. The sun disappeared. The witnesses of 536 could not know which mountain had erupted. They could not measure sulfate aerosols or read carbon isotopes in a tree. Their descriptions survived because the event violated everything they expected from the sky. Modern science has confirmed the heart of their testimony. A major eruption darkened the Northern Hemisphere. Another enormous eruption followed around 540. Summers cooled sharply in many regions. Plague then entered the connected world of the Roman Empire. But science has also dismantled the neatest version of the story. We do not know the source volcano of 536. We cannot assign one global harvest failure, one universal death rate, or one simple cause for the transformation of antiquity. The worst year in history is a powerful title, not a measurable fact. What remains is more unsettling than a simple disaster story. Complex societies depend on patterns they rarely notice. The arrival of seasons, the movement of food, the health of distant ports, and the assumption that one crisis will end before the next begins. In the middle of the 6th century, those assumptions failed together. The sun returned, the empire continued, humanity adapted. But inside trees and glaciers, the planet kept the record. If you want more evidence-led documentaries about the moments that changed history, subscribe to Chronos AI Media. The next cold case is already waiting.